This happened to me in the summer of 1993, when I was growing up in a town called Aldermont, the kind of place where everybody's family had been there for 2 or 3 generations, where the paper route was still delivered by a kid on a bike, and where the biggest excitement most weeks was whether the Rexall drugstore was going to restock the good candy. We had woods on every side of town, real woods, the kind that ran for miles into old logging country, cut through with abandoned railroad grades and gravel roads nobody bothered naming. The Fenwick Fish and Game Hatchery sat about 4 miles out, past the quarry, along a dead creek that used to feed the ponds before the state shut the place down sometime in the 60s. Nobody my age had ever been out there. Our parents talked about it the way people talk about a place that used to matter and now just sits there rotting. There was some old story about budget cuts, a flood, or possibly both. Either way, it had been abandoned longer than any of us had been alive. That summer, though, people started talking about it again. It started small. Denny Aldrich's 10-speed bicycle went missing from outside the Rexall, and 2 days later, Sheriff Hollis found it half a mile down the old rail bed, its wheel bent as if somebody had ridden it hard and dumped it in the brush. Then Mrs. Kessler, who lived at the very end of Birch Street where the pavement gave out, told my mother she had seen a light bobbing through the trees past midnight beyond her fence line, moving slowly and steadily like somebody carrying a lantern who knew exactly where they were going. Then there was the diner. Vera, who ran the counter at the Aldermont Diner and knew everything that happened in that town before it happened, mentioned to my dad that somebody had been going through the trash bins out back for 3 nights in a row. Not raccoons. Raccoons do not stack cardboard. My friend Pete Rourke found the footprints. He and his older brother had gone out past the quarry road looking for a lost hunting dog, and along the creek bed, in the mud, there were boot prints headed toward the hatchery. They were fresh, pressed directly over a week's worth of rain that should have washed away anything old. There was also the business with the county map. Mr. Hollis, Sheriff Hollis, was not related to Vera, though half the town assumed they were cousins. He mentioned to my father over coffee that somebody had come into the courthouse that spring, asking to look at old property surveys for the northern end of the county. The clerk had not thought much of it at the time. People requested those records for all kinds of reasons, including hunting leases and boundary disputes. It only came up later because nobody could remember what the man looked like. They only remembered that he had worn a ball cap pulled low and had not given a name for the visitor log, which the clerk was supposed to require but had not bothered enforcing. Then there was the fire. It was not a large one. Somebody had built a campfire beyond the old rail grade, close enough to the hatchery property that a hunter reported it to the sheriff's office as a fire hazard. It was August, and the woods were as dry as kindling. When the deputy drove out to investigate, the fire was already dead and covered with dirt, as though whoever had built it knew someone would come looking and wanted it gone quickly. The deputy found candy wrappers nearby and a torn scrap of paper covered with numbers that nobody could understand. It was not a telephone number or a license plate. It was simply a column of figures, like a tally somebody had been keeping. None of it was much on its own. Put together, however, it became the kind of story that gets passed from kid to kid at the edge of a baseball diamond, growing a little each time. By the middle of July, half the boys in Aldermont had a theory. Some said it was a Vietnam veteran living wild in the woods. Some said it was an escaped convict. My personal favorite, courtesy of Denny Aldrich, was that it was a Bigfoot that had learned to steal bicycles, which even at 15 I recognized as a stretch. What finally got the 3 of us moving was not any of that. It was me, Pete, and my friend Ruth Calloway, who could hike farther than either of us without even trying. It was the branches. Ruth found them on a Sunday, beyond the property line markers the state had installed decades earlier. They were rusted metal stakes with numbers stamped into them that nobody paid attention to anymore. She said somebody had been snapping low branches along a stretch of trail, not accidentally, but in a deliberate pattern. One branch had been broken every 10 feet or so, and all of them pointed in the same direction, toward the hatchery. "It's a trail," she said. Somebody made a trail, and they don't want people to notice that it's a trail. That got our attention in a way rumors about ghosts never could. We told ourselves we were only going to look. We packed as though we were going camping instead of trespassing. We brought a couple of flashlights, a thermos of orange soda, and Pete's dad's old Kodak disposable camera, which still had half a roll of film left inside. Ruth brought a paper map her father used during deer season. The hatchery was marked on it as a small black square with no label at all, as though whoever had drawn the map had forgotten it was there too. We rode out on a Saturday afternoon in August, left our bicycles at the edge of the quarry road, and walked the rest of the way. The hatchery buildings emerged from the trees the way old places do. You see the roofline before you understand what you are looking at. Two long concrete raceways, both empty and cracked, ran alongside a low brick building with most of its windows boarded over. A rusted chain-link fence sagged around the property, serving more as a suggestion than a barrier. Somebody had cut a section of it completely open. The metal edges had been bent backward like a mouth. We entered through the gap. The main building smelled like standing water and cold concrete. Most of it was what you would expect. There were empty tanks, a rusted control panel, and pipe fittings scattered across the floor. But at the back, inside a room that must once have been a records office, somebody had been living. It was not the kind of careless squatting you would expect from a passing drifter. This was organized. There was a cot with a folded army blanket, a kerosene lantern, and 24 cassette tapes stacked neatly inside a shoebox. Each tape had been labeled in careful block letters with nothing but a date. Then we saw the boxes. 4 cardboard boxes, all dry despite the dampness of the room, were filled with photographs. There were hundreds of them. Pete was the first to realize they had been sorted by season. Each stack was secured with a rubber band and topped with a scrap of paper marked spring, fall, or winter. Underneath the season were initials, not names, just letters. JK front porch, morning. RC kitchen window, dusk. The photographs themselves showed nothing dramatic. They showed houses, yards, a woman hanging laundry, and a man getting into a truck. They were ordinary moments from ordinary lives, photographed from a distance and then photographed again and again over what must have been years. You could tell by the way the cars in the driveways changed and the trees grew larger. Ruth found the map. It was a county survey map, the kind you could get from the courthouse, and somebody had marked it with dozens of small red dots scattered across 3 counties, not just ours. Next to some of the dots were dates going back much further than any of us had expected. 1961, 1968, 1974. Whoever this was had not started with us. We were not even close to being the first. Underneath the map, folded flat at the bottom of the box, we found something else. There was a stack of index cards, each one secured to a small manila envelope with a rubber band. The cards contained short notes. They did not read like diary entries. They read more like inventory records. Blue truck replaced with brown, 1989. New dog, spring. Kids stopped riding bike to school, walks now. It felt less like somebody was obsessed with one particular person and more like somebody was keeping careful records on an entire town, updating them the way a farmer might track which fields needed attention during a particular season. That was the moment the afternoon stopped feeling like an adventure. Pete picked up one of the cassette tapes and turned it over in his hands as though it might tell him something the label would not. "Why would you record nothing?" he asked. It just says porch. What's on a tape of a porch? None of us wanted to find out badly enough to ask whether there was a cassette player nearby. What got to me, and what still gets to me, was the fifth box. It sat apart from the others, its rubber band broken and hanging loosely, as though somebody had opened it in a hurry. Inside were photographs of our street, my street. I found one of our mailbox, our actual mailbox. My father's name was barely visible on the side, but there was a gap in the stack, a space between two photographs where something of the same size had clearly been removed. You could see a perfectly clean rectangle in the dust where the photograph had rested until recently. Recently enough that the dust had not settled back around the edges. Somebody had taken a photograph of my house, and it was no longer in the box. That was when we heard the truck. It was not close. It came from far away, somewhere down towards the quarry road. An engine was starting in a place where no engine should have been. We had left our bicycles there, and we had not seen any vehicles during the entire walk-in. Pete swore under his breath. Ruth was already moving toward the door. We left the way we had entered, passing through the opening in the fence and disappearing into the trees. That was when Pete's flashlight began to die. Its beam flickered down to a weak orange thread before going out completely, as though the batteries had chosen that exact moment to fail. Mine still worked, but barely. We did not talk. We simply walked quickly toward where we thought the quarry road was. Somewhere to our right, among the trees, something moved with us. It was not coming toward us. It was moving alongside us. It matched our pace closely enough that when we stopped for a second to get our bearings, the woods stopped too. We became turned around near the old rail bed. I still do not know how. We had walked through that same area on the way in. We eventually reached the little wooden footbridge that crossed the dry creek, but most of its planks were gone. They had not rotted away. They had been removed. The planks were stacked neatly to one side, as though somebody had taken the bridge apart on purpose and intended to put it back together later. Ruth went ahead to look for another way across. For perhaps 30 seconds, probably less, though it did not feel that way, we could not see her beyond a thick stand of sumac. Pete called her name once quietly, as though he did not want his voice to travel too far. She answered from farther down the bank than either of us expected. She was already moving. Neither of us asked why she had gone so far without saying anything. We simply followed her. We went around through the creek bed itself, and that was when Ruth suddenly stopped us. "Look," she said, pointing toward the mud. Our own footprints were there from the walk-in, about half an hour old, but pressed over the top of them, moving in the opposite direction, toward the hatchery rather than away from it, was a second set. Boot prints. They were fresh enough that water was still seeping into their edges. Somebody had followed our trail into the hatchery on foot after we had already passed. We ran the rest of the way to the bicycles. Sheriff Hollis believed enough of our story to drive out there himself, 2 days later with a deputy and Pete's father. I was not allowed to go, but Pete said the boxes were gone by the time they arrived. The cot, the lantern, and the cassette tapes were gone too. All of it. Somebody had cleared the room down to bare concrete, quickly and thoroughly, as though they had experience doing exactly that. The sheriff spoke to a retired forest ranger named Earl Dunmore, who had once patrolled that stretch of a county land. Earl told him that reports from that area went back to the late 50s. Pete overheard this part from his father. There had been trespassing complaints and a missing persons case from 1963 that was never solved. A young woman had walked out in that direction and never returned home, although nobody ever connected her disappearance directly to the hatchery. Earl said he had always believed somebody local knew those woods better than anyone realized. He never gave a name. I do not think he had one to give. The fence was repaired that fall. The county placed a padlock on a gate that led to nothing but empty buildings. A few years later, the hatchery was demolished completely, and nobody in Aldermont said much about it either way. Pete's disposable camera was not developed until years later, when we were both in our 20s. He found the roll of film inside a drawer while clearing out his parents' house. Most of the photographs were what you would expect. There were blurry pictures of the concrete raceways and one photograph of Ruth standing beside the opening in the fence, making a face at the camera. But the final 2 exposures on the roll showed pictures none of us remembered taking. Both photographs showed the 3 of us walking away from the hatchery toward the quarry road. They had been taken from behind, from somewhere among the trees, off to the side. Pete mailed me a copy. I still keep it in a drawer that I do not open very often. We never discovered who it was. Sheriff Hollis retired a few years later, and as far as I know, the file, assuming there ever was one, is sitting inside a box in a courthouse basement somewhere. It is one more unsolved mystery among hundreds of others. Sometimes I think about those red dots on the map. The ones that went back to 1961, long before any of us were born, spread across 3 counties as though somebody had been doing careful, patient work for longer than most people remain alive. I think about the empty rectangle in the dust where a photograph of my house once rested. Mostly I think about how whoever took those final 2 photographs on Pete's roll had to have been close enough to hear us breathing. And none of us ever heard a thing.